I walked in and the cafeteria doors were locked. A printed notice taped to the glass saying the kitchen was closed for food misuse and disrespect. And I felt something snap in my chest, as if someone had taken the one safe thing from our day. The only other place to get food was a convenience store 2 miles away, and leaving campus at lunch was against the rules. So the notice was more than an inconvenience. It was a punishment that landed on every kid in the building whether we'd done anything wrong or not. I heard people murmuring, teachers shifting in their seats, and then Principal Karen Blake, who everyone called Karen, the woman who ran the school, told us in first period that it would stay shut until whoever caused the problem owned up, like this was some lesson in responsibility and we were all supposed to learn it together. She said collective responsibility will teach accountability, and the way she said it made it sound like a victory for her, not a crisis for us. The athletes took the hit first. Our soccer players and swimmers had been running before dawn and burning through calories like crazy, and suddenly they had nothing to replace the energy. I watched one of the captains in history class, red-eyed and annoyed, whisper, "I can't make it through practice on water alone," and the whole room stiffened because the stakes were real and not theoretical. Kids started trying to sneak snacks in backpacks or behind lockers, things they could trade under the radar, but Karen had already sent an email that morning to every teacher ordering food confiscated on site. The email read, "Any outside food found in school will be taken and disposed of. This is non-negotiable." Teachers told us to hand it over, and some did. Others looked embarrassed like they didn't want to be police for a policy they hadn't voted on. Michael, friend, type 1 diabetic, sat next to me in math and kept checking his wrist pump while his face went pale. He whispered, "I forgot to bring extra glucose. The nurse has to have something, right?" But the nurse could only do so much if the school's rules made access harder. I saw him slip down the hall to the nurse twice that morning, coming back shaky and quiet. Mr. Stone, our chemistry teacher, tried to be casual but kept glancing at the clock, knowing a lab period without a proper lunch could be dangerous for some of us. He said, "If anyone needs to step out for medical reasons, don't hesitate." But the message from the office hung over everything like a cloud. By the second day, the tension grew. Some kids started passing notes and setting up secret snack trades behind the bleachers, but the risk of getting caught and having staff throw away your food was real. A few students who needed regular nutrition for health reasons were left in a bind. One kid in my English class had an IEP that specifically mentioned snacks for management, and he kept a tiny bag of crackers hidden in his locker because he was afraid of being humiliated if anyone found out. When the administration sealed off the cafeteria, they didn't localize blame, they spread consequences. It felt unfair and sloppy, and like someone somewhere had decided a scapegoat would be better than accountability. A small group of students started talking about options, because silence looked like acceptance and none of us wanted to sign off on that. Claire, quiet, older junior, granddaughter of a longtime board member and daughter of a lawyer, met with some of us in the library corner, folding her hands and speaking low. She said, "We need parents to come in and force the issue. If people show up for their kids, they can't pretend there's nothing wrong." Her voice was steady. The plan sounded risky but smart. Parents were allowed to visit during lunch, and if they flooded the campus, the administration would either have to let them in or face a louder public problem. Teachers were in a rough spot. Some followed Karen's email to the letter, confiscating food and scanning it into a log. Others stuffed confiscated granola bars into their desk drawers, quietly telling kids to eat them later because they couldn't stomach throwing food away. Ms. Moore, the nurse, spent more time that week with her phone open, logging glucose readings and calling parents. She pulled me aside once and said, "Document everything. If this goes where I think it will, medical logs will matter." Her voice was thin with worry, and she kept glancing toward the hall where Michael disappeared to sit and rest. Rumors started like wildfire. Some said a student prank had ruined everything, others said adults were fighting behind the scenes. Whatever the origin, the closure forced a choice on the rest of us: comply and go hungry or push back and risk punishment. Karen framed it as character building, a test of maturity, but a test that demanded we suffer first and explain later. I felt the unfairness as a physical thing, like a weight on my shoulders, and I knew people would start making plans to bring food, call lawyers, or throw tantrums. The energy in the school that week felt like a powder keg, quiet on top but ready to blow. By Tuesday, the whole thing felt like it was getting away from us. You could see it in the way kids moved through the halls slower, like somebody had cut the oxygen. Students with medical needs were the ones who showed the strain first. They were dizzy, shaky, and a few of them had to leave class early because they were lightheaded. I watched Michael, my friend who has type 1 diabetes, check his sugar twice in first period and head to the nurse a third time before lunch. He came back pale, hands trembling, and muttered, "I keep telling myself I'm okay," but his voice sounded thin and frightened. Ms. Moore, our nurse, the person who patched us up for scraped knees and got us ice packs, looked angry in a way that didn't fit her calm face. She kept clicking her pen and writing notes in a book she wouldn't let anyone read. She could document everything, she told me, but paperwork doesn't hand you a sandwich or a glucose tab when you need one. I spent part of that morning watching Ms. Moore talk on the phone and stare at the log she was building. Later, she found me in the cafeteria hallway and said, "If anyone needs to record times they went to the nurse, do it. If there are emergencies, I want details." Her jaw was tight, and she sounded like someone holding back steam that could explode any minute. The administration had told her to enforce rules but not to disobey medical directives, and that contradiction left her muted and furious at the same time. She told me, "I can't be the only adult who notices what's happening," and then made me promise to tell anyone who asked to write down what they saw. Wednesday changed everything fast. During chemistry, Maya, a quiet sophomore who usually sat 3 rows up from me, slid off her stool and nearly hit the floor until Mr. Stone, our chemistry teacher, lunged and caught her. He's the kind of teacher who acts before he thinks, and he shouted, "Call the nurse," while cradling her head. Maya was breathing but far away, eyes half-lidded. I remember the shock in the room like a sound. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Parents flooded the main line at once, calling the school, leaving frantic voicemails, some angry, some terrified. "You need to fix this," a voice said through a phone speaker into the office. "My child nearly passed out," another parent said, and Rachel in the office tried to hold the lines together while the emotion frayed her usual calm. That night I met Claire in a corner of the library with 4 other students who wanted to do something that wasn't just complaining on group chat. Claire, quiet junior, granddaughter of a longtime board member and daughter of a lawyer, sat with her hands folded and laid out a plan like she was reading from a playbook she'd been thinking about for a while. She said, "Parents are allowed on campus during lunch. If we ask them to come, to bring food, and to stay as long as they like, we'll force the administration into a choice, either welcome them or make the district look awful." Her voice was measured. She added, "If 100 or 200 cars show up, the fire marshal and the press will see what's actually happening here." We argued through the logistics. Someone said, "Won't Karen call the police or make them leave?" And Claire answered, "She can ask, but parents have legal right to be here during the noon period. If parents refuse to leave, then Karen's escalation becomes public. That's the point." We thought about timing, about how to spread the word without sounding like we were provoking violence. Another student suggested a sign-up sheet and a note parents could bring to show they were just coming for lunch with their kids. I remember thinking it sounded risky and brilliant at the same time. The kind of plan you only get when people are desperate enough to be bold. Claire's family connections mattered, and not in the small-talk way. She knew enough about board rules and parental rights to make the plan plausible without breaking laws. She said, "This isn't a stunt, it's a legal daylight strategy. If they bar people, we get records. If they let people in, then we feed kids." We all agreed to be careful with messaging. The group split tasks, someone to text parents, someone to contact local reporters we trusted, and someone to print a short flyer explaining the purpose. To make sure kids with medical needs got access to food and to protest the collective punishment. The next morning, I went to school feeling like I was part of something that might change the way people thought about fairness and authority. I also felt like I might get in trouble. Either way, it didn't feel like something we could let sit. Michael texted me that night and said, "If people come, I'll tell my parents to bring stuff. I can't keep doing this alone." His message made the plan feel less theoretical and more urgent. Claire's idea had turned the problem into a possible solution, one that demanded adults show up for their kids or prove they were willing to let them suffer. That thought made me catch my breath because it finally felt like a way to force a grown-up decision instead of waiting for one. Thursday at 11:30 a.m., the parking lot filled so fast it felt like someone had opened a faucet. Parents poured in and parked on the grass because there weren't any spots left. And by 11:45, there were more than 100 people milling around the front office waiting for visitor badges with coffee cups and takeout bags in hand. I stood on the sidewalk watching cars creep forward, and at one point a dad pushed his stroller past a parked SUV and said, "We're not leaving our kids hungry," like it was the most natural thing in the world. The office staff were drowning in sign-in sheets and trying to hand out badges while also answering phones, and you could see the panic on their faces when the flow never stopped. About 30 minutes later, a man in a uniform arrived and started talking to the office staff in a low voice that made people hush. The fire marshal stood near the main doors and pointed at the parked cars blocking the fire lane, saying, "This is a safety hazard. You need clear egress now." Someone shouted that parents had every right to be there, and he looked over the crowd with a tired expression and said, "I enforce safety codes. If vehicles block fire lanes, I will write a citation." It felt like the whole thing had stabilized on a razor edge. Parents were there with the law on their side about visitor access, and the fire marshal was there with the law on his side about safety. Karen sent out an all-staff email not long after, the tone clipped and final. Her message told every teacher and staff member to clear the building and to insist visitors sign out and leave if they were in restricted areas. She wrote, "All staff must comply. Thank you for your cooperation." I saw an assistant in the office reading it and telling a father with a takeout box, "The principal has asked that everyone please disperse now." The father folded his arms and answered, "We're here until our kids are fed. We're not leaving." And suddenly everybody held their breath because the situation looked like it could spark into something bigger. By Friday, the protest had grown into something that felt like a movement. Claire's grandmother, longtime board member, drove up with a car full of takeout and a calm look that said she knew exactly what the law said and wasn't afraid to use her voice. The lot was packed with nearly 300 parents carrying bags from local restaurants. When security asked Claire's grandmother to step aside and leave campus, she looked them in the eye and said, "I serve on the board. I will not leave until my granddaughter tells me to." Her defiance made some people cheer softly and made others look away like they were waiting for trouble. That weekend, the stakes turned real and ugly. Michael crashed at home from unstable blood sugar in a way that scared his parents so badly they called a lawyer that night. On Monday morning, they filed a lawsuit seeking immediate accommodations and damages, and I remember reading the court notice that floated across our group chat like a live grenade. The suit named the district and alleged that denying access to food had put Michael at risk, and the language in the filing felt clinical and cold compared to how scared we all were for our friend. When I saw Michael at school that week, his hands shook, and his parents' faces were set like metal. The lawsuit made everything official in a way no amount of group chat outrage could. Karen reacted fast. She reopened the cafeteria as a kind of olive branch, posting a notice that food service would resume, but she also suspended Claire for organizing the parent drop-ins, calling them disruptive. The suspension notice said Claire had violated the code of conduct by encouraging trespass and creating a safety risk. The two actions together felt like half measures, a concession and a punishment tied together like a bad trade. People in the hallways reacted like someone had struck a match. Some cheered the reopening, while others screamed that suspending Claire after parents had shown up was cowardly and vindictive. The school erupted into arguments, chants, and heated conversations that filled the air between classes. My phone buzzed nonstop with texts from parents, students, and teachers who either praised Karen for restoring order or accused her of using Claire as a scapegoat. I remember walking past the cafeteria and seeing kids clustered in groups, some handing out flyers for the coming board meeting, others debating whether further protests would help or hurt. A few teachers tried to calm students, telling us to stay focused, but their faces gave them away. They were caught between loyalty to the job and outrage at how fast the administration had escalated. Claire sat in the hallway with her grandmother that afternoon and kept her head down while people said things to her, some supportive, some nasty. She told me quietly, "I didn't start this fire, I just lit a match." Her voice was small but steady, and her grandmother squeezed her hand like it was the only answer either of them needed. The moment felt raw and immediate, the kind that changes how you remember a place. The cafeteria doors may have been unlocked again, but the real fight had just begun and everyone knew it. News traveled faster than gossip that week. A local reporter, Penelope Reed, reporter for the town paper, messaged Claire and me and asked if she could come by and see what we had. Claire and I met her in the library and handed over copies of emails the flyer parents used and a timeline we'd been building in case things got legal. Penelope listened the whole time, asked sharp questions, and wrote everything down like she knew how a single quote could change a story. She said, "You've got to be precise," and we agreed to give her all the documentation we had. When her piece published on Tuesday, it hit like a stone thrown into a pond. People shared it everywhere, posting screenshots and arguing in comments. The article quoted Karen's staff email verbatim. "Students need to understand actions have consequences. Confiscate any food immediately." Seeing the words printed in the paper made the policy feel less like a rumor and more like an order with the principal's signature on it. Parents who had been on the fence suddenly had proof to use in phone calls and board meeting speeches, and students who had felt ignored now had a public voice. Ms. Moore, our nurse, pulled me aside after the article and slid a stack of printouts across the nurse's table like it was contraband. Her log showed nurse visits spiking during the cafeteria closure, with entries for low blood sugar, dizziness, fainting, and kids sent home. She pointed to a list and said, "Look at these timestamps. This is the week it happened." She had circled times when kids came in sweaty and shaky and had written short notes about their symptoms. Ms. Moore's handwriting was neat, but the entries themselves told a messy story of kids who were suffering for a policy. She told me she was saving everything, that she would not delete a single chart or note in case someone needed to subpoena her records. "I'm not looking to get anyone fired," she said quietly. "I just want the kids safe." Her voice had that tired clarity people get when they've been doing the right thing against a stupid rule for too long. "I promised to keep a copy of everything and to encourage other students or parents to document visits to the nurse, including times and symptoms." Ms. Moore nodded and said, "If it goes to court, paper will beat memory." Within a day of Penelope's piece, Michael's parents had met with their attorney and gone to court seeking immediate relief for his condition. The judge issued an emergency order requiring the school to provide Michael with access to food and medical accommodations during the school day. "I got the message from Michael that night. Order came through, I don't know what to feel." He sounded relieved but shaken. The court filing used clinical language about immediate medical necessity and failure to accommodate. But for Michael, the order meant not passing out in class and not having to ask a teacher for scraps. The emergency order changed the stakes. It made the issue legal and no longer just a school drama. The district had to respond, and teachers started getting memos with more careful language about following medical directives over office policy. Some staff members sighed with relief because they had been ordered to confiscate and felt lousy doing it. Others worried about administrative backlash for being seen as unsupportive of the principal. The atmosphere in the staff room shifted from fearful compliance to a nervous balancing act between the law and loyalty. Parents used the article and Ms. Moore's logs in calls with administrators and in social media posts. People who hadn't been involved suddenly had something concrete to point at. A printed email and nurse records showing students were harmed. A few parents wrote to the school board demanding immediate policy changes, and one group coordinated a list of documented incidents to present at the next board meeting. The paperwork made the outrage less theatrical and more procedural. It turned feelings into evidence, and evidence is harder to ignore. Claire and I kept talking to reporters and parents, handing out copies of nurse logs and screenshots of emails. Penelope called twice more, saying she was following up with district lawyers and asking tough questions about collective punishment. The paper printed quotes from parents who had to miss work to feed their kids, and from teachers who said they were uncomfortable enforcing the confiscation policy. By the time the judge's order went public, the story felt like it had moved from a hallway fight into a courtroom, and the school couldn't sweep it under a rug anymore. The legal action and public reporting together pushed the district into a defensive position it couldn't easily defend. The week after the article, the school tightened like a fist around anything that moved, and I felt it from the first bell down to the last. Administration rolled out random bag checks without warning. One morning, a security guard stopped me and said, "Empty your pockets, please," like I was a suspect. They enforced tardies the way a stopwatch enforcer might. Seconds counted and teachers had to mark names down. Hall passes became mandatory and laminated, and the office handed out a stack of them like they were valuables. The message was clear: any sign of dissent would be met with rules. It made people walk smaller and talk quieter because the cost of being loud felt suddenly real. They started doling out Saturday detentions to dozens of students who had been involved in the parent drop-ins and protests, and I watched classmates get slips with dates and times. One kid in my class said, "They're punishing us for our parents showing up," and his voice cracked because it sounded ridiculous when you said it out loud. Teachers handed out detentions as if following orders, and some looked ashamed while others looked relieved they had a way to reassert control. When I asked a teacher why, she muttered, "They're trying to deter future disruptions." Like deterrence was a simple fix for people who were scared or hungry. In the background, Superintendent Alan Weaver met with Principal Karen in closed-door sessions that the teachers and parents had no right to attend. I heard about the meeting secondhand from a teacher who came back pale and said, "They told us to limit what we say publicly," and then looked down at her shoes. Staff were suddenly pressured about public statements. HR sent an email reminding all staff to route media questions through the district office. Teachers who had volunteered statements to reporters got calls from administrators asking them to retract or soften quotes. The silence the admin wanted felt like a muzzle on people who had been trying to help. Some teachers pushed back in private. Mr. Stone quietly started documenting incidents himself, filling pages with dates and notes about students who needed medical care during the closure week. Others considered signing a no-confidence letter against Karen, whispering in the faculty room that leadership had failed us. The idea of a no-confidence vote felt like a nuclear option, something that could change careers and lives, so teachers moved carefully. I saw them trade glances and make small marks in notebooks like they were building a case, the way we had been taught to build evidence in history class. Meanwhile, parents recalibrated. The group that had brought families to campus turned into a machine of logistics, coordinating shirts, carpools, and sign-up lists for who would speak at the board meeting. Someone took charge of a spreadsheet with names and times, and another parent printed a short script for people who felt shaky speaking in public. I remember seeing a message in our group chat where read, "Carpool if you can, bring copies of the nurse logs." The organization felt professional and fierce, and it made sense because the fight had become procedural and public. The fire marshal's citation about blocked fire lanes went public and landed like an official gavel. Seeing it printed made the safety argument something the district couldn't ignore, and it gave the administration both an excuse and a problem. They had to address safety concerns while also answering why they had closed the cafeteria in the first place. People who had been on the fence shifted their tone, some siding with parents for safety reasons and others siding with the school because they believed order mattered more than protest. The citation complicated the moral clarity we had been feeling and made everything messier in the public eye. Rumors spread that the complaint that triggered the closure hadn't come from students at all but from an adult coach, and when that idea got traction, everything shifted again. If true, it suggested a grown-up had pushed for a shutdown and then kids ended up punished for a problem they didn't cause. I heard, a coach filed a complaint, in whispers in the hall, and watched jaws tighten when people thought about the possibility. It made me angrier in a direct way. The idea that adults would weaponize rules and then expect kids to suffer for an adult fight felt like a betrayal. The rumor didn't resolve anything, but it made the argument sharper and gave parents more reason to demand accountability at the board meeting. The tightening rules, the closed sessions, the teacher pressure, and the growing parent organization all felt like different parts of the same story. Power trying to reassert itself while everyone else tried to document and defend what mattered. We were moving from outrage to paperwork, from anger to procedure, and it was uncomfortable because it meant the battle lines were being drawn in copy rooms and court filings instead of in classes where kids should have been learning. I kept thinking that if we wanted change, documentation and public pressure would have to do the heavy lifting, because shouting in the hallways no longer cut it against a whole system determined to control the narrative. Claire appealed her suspension with a binder so thick I could barely hold it when she passed it to me in the hallway. She's a junior, granddaughter of a longtime board member and daughter of a lawyer, and she had every document stacked inside: policy citations, screenshots of emails, witness statements, and a timeline we'd been building. She told me, "They'll have to read this," and I believed her because the binder was calm and brutal in the way facts can be. The compliance panel took it during a closed hearing and told Claire they'd issue a written decision within a week, which felt like both a victory and a countdown. After the appeal, administration started calling students in one by one for interviews that smelled of two things: formality and strategy. The assistant principal sat across from me with a blank legal pad and asked the same questions in slightly different words, trying to pin down who organized what and who told parents to come. The tone felt like someone building a case, not solving a problem. I left the office thinking, they're trying to make Claire the story, because each question slid back to her role and the timing of her messages, even when other students had been equally involved. Some teachers quietly warned us that the interviews might be used to support disciplinary actions. Mr. Stone pulled me aside and said, "Be honest but don't volunteer more than they ask." He looked tired and wary and his voice was small in the noisy hall. The way adults circled around the questioning made me feel like we were under a microscope, and it changed how we talked in the cafeteria line. Simple jokes felt dangerous. Any mention of a plan could be replayed later as evidence of intent. Meanwhile, the court decrees moved beyond emergency orders. Michael's restraining order became an enforceable accommodation that guaranteed he could keep snacks and made clear the district could not retaliate against him or his family for seeking help. The court spelled out that denying access to medically necessary food was unacceptable, and anyone who interfered with Michael's accommodations could be held responsible. His parents told us the order was relief, but it also made things painfully public. Michael didn't want extra attention, yet the paperwork put him in a spotlight he hadn't asked for. We started planning a protest that wasn't loud or messy, but that would still make a visible point. The idea came from a mix of desperation and strategy. A silent demonstration in the cafeteria, where hundreds of us would sit motionless with the evidence of our deprivation on the tables, glucose tabs, empty wrappers, unopened juice boxes, so anyone walking through would see the problem without hearing a shout. Claire messaged, no chanting, no throwing food, just show up and sit. The simplicity of the plan made it harder for administrators to call it dangerous or unruly. On Thursday, hundreds of us took seats in the commons and arranged our items like small, quiet signs. I remember how the air felt heavy and patient at once, like we were holding our breath together. I set out a small pack of glucose tabs I'd borrowed from Ms. Moore and an unopened protein bar I refused to eat in protest, and people all around me had similar little piles. No one shouted. No one moved. The sight of so many empty or unopened snacks made a strange kind of noise in the room, without a word being said. Karen came through the commons at one point, walking slow, looking at faces and at the items on the tables. She paused, her jaw tight, and then turned and left the way she had come in. She didn't call for security, didn't have students removed, and didn't issue immediate discipline. For a minute that felt like triumph because the protest had been both peaceful and impossible to ignore. It forced the administration to face a living photograph of what their policies had done to real people. The silence stretched for nearly an hour, with cameras and phones hovering at the edges and teachers watching like they'd been handed an unscripted moment. Students whispered to each other about next steps and about how the footage would play out on social media and at the upcoming board meeting. Some teachers quietly thanked us and slipped out to photocopy nurse logs or to print the legal order that secured Michael's accommodations. The peaceful protest had shifted the argument again from who did what to what had happened to us. Afterwards, people felt raw but steadier. The protest didn't fix everything and the district still had to respond with policy and paperwork, but the act of showing up silently together made the issue tangible in a way emails and hearings hadn't. Claire told me later, we made them look at the problem, and I understood what she meant. The room had held a truth that couldn't be edited out. The next week would bring more papers, more questions, and the panel's written decision. But the silence in the cafeteria had carved out space where our voices could finally be heard as facts, not just complaints. The night of the board meeting, the auditorium was packed like a kettle about to boil. More than 200 people jammed into seats meant for far fewer, and you could feel the heat and the breath of the room like the city itself had come to argue. I was nervous but steady because we had a stack of paperwork that said we weren't making this up. When my name came up, I walked to the microphone and spoke for 3 minutes, the light hot on my face, and rattled off dates, times, copies of the nurse logs, the confiscation email from Karen that said, students need to understand actions have consequences, and the fire marshal citation about blocked fire lanes. I said, these are facts. These are what happened, and the room listened like it was waiting for proof. Michael went after me and his voice shook, but he pushed through it. He told the board how he'd collapsed, how he was tired all the time since that week, and how he had to start carrying snacks with a court order backing him up. He said, I missed one whole day of class because I passed out at home, and you could hear people in the crowd catching their breath. His testimony was a wound made public, not dramatic on purpose, just honest and scary, and a few people in the room wiped their eyes. Parents spoke next, some recounting time off work to make lunches and others detailing kids sent home. The gallery filled with people holding copies of nurse records, screenshots of emails, and printed social posts that tracked the week. Superintendent Alan Weaver stood up and laid out the district's side of the ledger in the kind of clinical way bureaucracies do. He presented nurse visit spikes, the fire marshal citation, the union chatter about a no-confidence draft, and the legal exposure from Michael's emergency order and the lawsuit the family filed. He said, we are facing both reputational and legal risk, and he recommended placing Karen on paid administrative leave while an independent review went forward. The room was quiet after he spoke, like the momentum had shifted from argument into formal procedure. The board debated and the vote was closer than anyone expected. It was 4-3 to place Karen on paid administrative leave and to appoint an interim principal. The narrow margin made the decision feel fragile and contested, but still decisive enough to change direction. There were audible reactions in the audience, sighs, small cheers, and a few angry mutters, because the vote was both a rebuke and a beginning. The interim principal walked in the next day and started undoing the most damaging policies right away. One of the first moves the interim made was to rescind the confiscation policy that had told teachers to take any outside food. They sent a memo that said medical needs take precedence and that students must be allowed medically necessary snacks in class. Teachers breathed out like they'd been holding their breath for weeks. Tardy enforcement relaxed, the strict second-by-second punishments eased. Hall passes stayed, but the tone was less punitive and more functional. Most of the Saturday detentions were canceled or converted into other forms of restorative work. The interim principal also made a clear note that retaliation against students or parents for speaking up would not be tolerated. The message was small but important. Policy could hurt, and policy could be changed. Claire's punishment was revisited too. Her suspension was reduced to a written warning that would not appear on college transcripts, and the compliance panel said they had taken into account her documentation and intent. She told me quietly, "I just wanted adults to show up for kids," and when she said it, you could see the relief and the cost at once. The district also committed to an independent review and announced the creation of a student advisory committee charged with drafting anti-collective punishment language and strengthening medical accommodation procedures. They asked students to help write the rules that would protect us in the future, which felt like the district admitting we belonged in the conversation, not just as witnesses but as participants. Over the next few weeks, change trickled in. The student handbook was updated to explicitly allow medical snacks during class. Cafeteria hours were extended a little and the menu gained a few more protein options, though lines were still long and shortages remained. Student representatives met with administrators regularly, and those meetings felt bizarrely adult. We walked into conference rooms with our notes and walked out knowing a little more about how policy is written. Ms. Moore kept saving her logs and offered to testify if needed. She stayed on and kept doing the work that mattered most. Legal matters and community tensions didn't disappear. Lawsuits and accommodation orders still worked their way through the system, and some families remained furious at how everything had been handled. Teachers debated leadership openly, and a few resigned quietly rather than stay in a district they felt conflicted about. The board promised an independent review and the results would take time, but the immediate changes were concrete and people noticed them in small daily ways. Kids allowed to keep snacks, fewer detentions, and administrators meeting with student reps for real conversation. The fight didn't end with a single night or a single vote, but it changed something on the ground. Students who documented incidents, organized quietly, and worked with parents showed that they could force adults to listen and to change policy. I left that board meeting feeling tired and raw, but also like our group had done something useful, not perfect, not complete, but a start. We had turned anger and fear into evidence and public testimony, and for now that was enough to make the adults in charge begin to fix what they'd broken. Months slid by and the town never stopped talking, but the worst chaos eased into a new normal that felt both fragile and real. Teachers kept writing notes and saving emails like they'd learned a lesson about paperwork. I'd bump into Mr. Stone in the hall and he'd say, "Keep copies of everything," like it was advice and a warning. Some teachers quietly updated resumes and talked about moves out of the district. "I love the kids," one teacher told me, "but I can't carry this kind of stress forever." The turnover rumors made us uneasy because stability matters in a school, but the documentation they were building helped students and parents hold the district accountable. Ms. Moore, our nurse, became a quiet anchor for the whole thing. She had conversations with lawyers and got job offers from clinics that wanted someone with the paperwork instincts she'd learned under pressure. She told me one afternoon, "I'm tempted, but I can't leave yet. These kids still need someone who will fight for them." She kept saving charts, calling parents, and showing up early to make sure the med room was stocked. I watched her balance exhaustion and stubbornness like she was keeping a light on through a long night. Michael began to breathe easier in small ways. With the court order and the handbook changes, he could carry snacks and the staff were clear they couldn't take them. He texted me, "I finally slept through the night," and I felt like the words should be bigger than text bubbles. His family entered settlement talks with the district and his parents told us they were focused on making sure other kids didn't go through the same thing. They said, "This is about more than money, it's about safety." The legal side moved slowly, but the practical outcome, Michael getting consistent access to food during the day, made a visible difference in his energy and attendance. The Student Advisory Committee met every other week, a mixed group of seniors, juniors, and parents who showed up with notebooks and questions. Claire, the quiet junior, granddaughter of a board member and daughter of a lawyer, became a steady presence in that group, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she knew how to keep documents in order. We drafted language that said, in plain terms, that collective punishment was forbidden and that students with documented medical needs would have guaranteed access to snacks. We argued about wording until it felt precise and fair. Claire said, "If it can be misread, it will be misused," and anyone who's watched policy battles knows she was right. Rebuilding trust took more than meetings. Administrators scheduled listen and learn sessions and sometimes sat through uncomfortable conversations where parents listed dates and nurses read logs aloud. Some administrators apologized in public, others defended choices but agreed to the review. The district promised an independent audit of policies and said it would publish the findings. "We owe you transparency," a board member told us at one meeting, and no one expected overnight healing, but the promise mattered because things that aren't written tend to disappear. We learned to pace ourselves because burnout threatened everyone: students, parents, and teachers. Claire and I set rules: 2 board meetings a week at most, 1 day a weekend without protests, and a clear handoff for tasks so neither of us tried to do everything. I remember Claire saying, "We're not a machine. We're people," and that line stuck because it's easy to treat moral fights like marathons without rest. We still showed up, but we scheduled sleep and small wins to keep from snapping. Local reporting stayed involved, not as a feeding frenzy but as steady coverage. Penelope Reed filed follow-ups that tracked small policy changes and quoted nurses and teachers who were willing to speak. Her pieces kept pressure on the district to follow through on promises. The community remained split. Some parents wanted more accountability, other families were tired of the conflict and wanted it to end. The tension didn't vanish, but the public record made it harder for the administration to quietly slide back into old habits. There were still legal loose ends, settlements being negotiated, lawyers drafting agreements with confidentiality clauses, and occasional stories about families who felt the district hadn't done enough. That legal work dragged on in the kind of slow, precise way lawsuits do. Meanwhile, on campus, the practical shifts mattered. The handbook now clearly allowed medical snacks. Cafeteria lines moved a bit faster in the mornings, and teachers were instructed to prioritize documented medical needs over administrative emails. In the end, what changed wasn't a grand overhaul but a set of small, enforceable rules that made school safer for vulnerable kids. The coalition of students, parents, a few courageous teachers, and steady local reporting produced changes that stuck in policy and practice. We hadn't solved every problem, and the community was still raw in places, but the experience taught us that organized, documented action can force accountability when institutions fail. I left most days exhausted, but sure that if we kept documentation, kept speaking, and kept asking adults to answer for choices, the system would be a little harder to ignore next time. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.